my guest actually joins me. He was the former Statistician General of the Federation as well as the Chief Executive Officer of the National Bureau of Statistics. He's currently a partner and the Chief Economist at KPMG Nigeria, Dr. Yemi Kale. Dr. Kale, good morning and thank you for joining us today. Let's quickly move ahead. You know that usually in a transition year, which we are currently in, um, federal government as well as states are, in what they call a lame duck manner. They are in a lame duck position, so to speak. Activities are slower. How crucial do you think this year is?
In a transition year, things usually slow down because a few months before that, a lot of energies were devoted towards the election, and after the election, there are people are focusing on winding down, and the new administration is focused, whether at the state or the federal, is focused on settling down. So economic activity typically slows down in a transition year. I don't expect that to be different this year, despite the fact that there's a need, unlike other transition years, for us to kickstart really quickly this time around. But I don't think that's going to be the case. It's not going to be the case. Even if it's improved slightly, I still think that economic activity is going to slow down. Issues with household consumption expenditures still exist. Investments, private sector investments, and also government investment will slow down because, again, the private sector will be playing the wait and see. They want to see who is going to be appointed by the incoming administration, the quality of the ministers and their direction. And those kinds of decisions, I believe, would result in a slowing down of economic activity.
Okay. We have a lot of challenges. What do you think are the frontliner challenges that are before Nigeria's economy now?
Well, where do I start? I think we have challenges on every area, whether it's the real sector, whether it's the external sector, whether it's monetary policy, fiscal. There are challenges everywhere. Like I started to explain, household consumption is significantly constrained. We have double digits hyperinflation. I think that the technical term, when it goes about 20%, with slow, vulnerable growth. And that growth is vulnerable, again, largely as a result of the inability of fiscal buffer. We don't actually have fiscal buffer. When your economy is slow and fragile, the risk of a recession or is high, and it's usually your fiscal buffers that you will use to spend your way out of that problem. But we have very, very constrained fiscal buffers. We have very high debt. We have very limited ability to generate revenue. I think at last count, I think our revenue to debt is about 80 plus percent. Your external reserves are still around, if they went up slightly recently, it's still about $36 billion. So actually, the economy is very, very fragile. Like I said, inflation is high, exchange rate challenges, foreign reserve accretion challenges, fiscal challenges, monetary policy challenges. There's lots of need for social investment and infrastructure investment. We have, unfortunately, like most political cycles, we have that divided system. So there are a lot, in addition to the security and other challenges affecting the economy. So it's a huge um, list of challenging things. I'm not particularly envying anybody that is coming to take over the economy at this particular point in time. It's a lot of work.
Okay, doctor.
But also a lot of opportunities, I guess.
Okay, doctor. Let's take a look at some of the challenges you've talked about, and one that is very significant is a pro-cyclical fiscal position that Nigeria has really been, at least in the last few years, perhaps from 2014, 2015 to 2021. How do you think that these challenges can be addressed, especially taking a look at our fiscal imbalances, debt servicing, high debt profile? Just earlier on, I did say that Nigeria's borrowings from the World Bank rose to about $13.6 billion. Our debt profile is around 44 trillion naira, excluding the ways and means. So how do you think that we can address the challenge of fiscal imbalance?
Well, I won't even exclude the ways and means because the only way that ways and means can be sorted is if it is put into the debt pool. So it's probably going to be more about more like 70 trillion at the end of the day. But the debt itself, the actual volume of the debt itself, in my opinion, is not the main problem. I always say that debt, the things that you should consider when you're looking at debt is not necessarily the volume of the debt. It's actually what the debt is being used for. What are we spending on? And once we agree that what is being spent on makes sense, is actually good for the economy, it could help the economy generate revenue in the medium to long term, then that's not the issue. The bigger issue is whether we're able to repay that debt. And the economy's ability to pay the debt is sound. You have a 200 trillion naira economy. The debt to GDP is about 30%, so it's still comfortable, which means that the capacity of the country to repay the debt exists, but the problem is in the ability of the country to pay that debt. That's why our tax to GDP is about 6 to 8%. It means we are only collecting 6 to 8% of a 200 trillion naira economy. Now, the only way you can handle that, well, you can handle it in three ways. One, you can expedite growth from the 3%, maybe take it to something like 10%. So your ratio still stays, but because the denominator increases, you get a lot more revenue to spend as well as to repay your debt. So you don't have to do anything in increasing the ratio. All you have to do is push your growth. And if you push your growth, even if it stays at 6 to 8% of GDP, because your GDP is larger, the overall tax you have to collect is also going to be harder. So you don't have to do anything in terms of the reforming tax. The second part is reforming tax, trying to get a lot more of the economy's activity in your tax or revenue net, expanding your tax and revenue to GDP from 6 to 8 to something like 15. I think 15 is the international best practice. Now, if you can do that, you increase your ability to spend as well as to repay your debt. Now, you have to, and of course, a third way to do this is also to control your expenditure. Go and do a proper assessment on what you are spending on. An example is the arguments on the subsidy. Also have to look at how you spend, how the government expenditure. Go and check what the different MDs are spending on, whether they are important expenditure in a critical area where you need a lot of revenue. Or most times you see different agencies with always buying computers and cars, and you see increases in office supplies and things like that. I'm not saying that's not important, but when you are trying to tighten your belt, you have to go back in there and check the quality of expenditure. When you have the revenue generating agencies that contribute surplus to government, which also increases the government's independent revenue, the surplus is also dependent on what they are spending on. So if you can control, and what you see is you increase the ability of many of these revenue generating agencies, and you find a situation where as their revenue is increasing and their targets are increasing, they find ways to also increase their expenditure. And at the end of the day, the operating surplus not increase. So you have to also check your expenditure, what you are spending on, to also generate more revenue to invest in infrastructure, in capital projects, as well as to repay your debt. Now, once you do, and once you do either of these, or preferably all of them, increase your growth, try and reform your tax system so you can get a lot more money from the system. And as far as that is concerned, I think the best way is to focus more on the informal sector activity. You have about 30 to 40% of your 200 billion economy in the informal sector. And if you check, just look at the state's IGR, for example, you see that only about 3% of states' IGR comes from the informal sector in terms of self-assessment. So there's a huge scope to generate a lot more revenue from that side rather than just increasing VAT and trying to increase taxes for those that already are paying. So I think it's a combination of different approaches to help you boost your fiscal buffers, to help you increase your revenue, so as to have a more manageable debt profile and have enough money to also invest, to spend in the economy, which is significantly needed.
Okay, back to the program. Dr. Yemi Kale is still with me. He is the partner and chief economist at KPMG Nigeria. He was the former statistician general of the Federation and the chief executive officer of the National Bureau of Statistics. Dr. Kale, thank you again for standing by. Now, you did talk about the macroeconomic challenges that Nigeria that we really have, and I don't even know where to start because there are so many issues. I did ask earlier on about the fiscal position of Nigeria, but as it is right now, what do you think that we can do to be able to address the joblessness and the unemployment situation in Nigeria? Because many people do not have jobs. Many people, their businesses have closed down, especially even after COVID. They've not been able to get their acts together. What do you think?
Well, the only way you create jobs is by expanding economic activity. If you look at the breakdown of the sectoral contribution to jobs,
Dr. Kale, if you can hear me, can you unmute your audio? Dr. Kale, can you hear me?
hello now. Can you hear
Okay,
me
can
now?
you hear me? Can you unmute?
Can you hear me now?
Dr. Kale, can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Okay, okay, go ahead, please.
I said if you look at the breakdown of the sectoral contribution to jobs, you will find that the sectors that are contributing to the largest share of growth are sectors that are not necessarily significant job creating sectors. And that's so you have to, the way to fix jobs is to create enough economic activity, but more importantly, the economic activity has to be in sectors that are more labor intensive, and that's how you actually can create more jobs. But if you keep creating, if the economy keeps growing as a result of sectors that are more capital or technology intensive and don't create more jobs for people, your economy will keep growing, but your job creation effort will be falling behind. And that's the first point. I think the best way to look at the unemployment crisis in Nigeria is to look at it. I like to use this example of the bathtub, where the tap is the number of entrants into the job market, and the drain is the number of jobs your economy can create. And you have a situation, if you have a situation like we do in Nigeria, where the tap is gushing faster than the ability of the drain to drain out that water, it's going to eventually overflow. And that's what we're having now. So jobs have been created in the economy, but the number of entrants into the job market, which on average is between 3 to 4 million every year, is extremely high. And the economy's ability to absorb 3 to 4 million new entrants every year it's a big problem. So you have to find a way of expanding economic activity significantly in sectors that absorb a lot more labor, that are more labor intensive. And the way to expand economic activity is, first of all, to meet domestic demand as well as to export. Our manufacturing, our production of goods and services in Nigeria is barely able to fulfill the domestic needs, not to mention meet the requirements for export. So I think that is basically, and you have to understand also that when you are producing goods and services, you are producing also to export. And if you are producing to export, you are competing rather with countries across the entire world. So you have to ensure you are providing international global consumers with goods that surpass the alternatives they have across the globe, improving the quality of your services at a better price, um, or providing something that they need but they do not have, or they already have but you can provide at a better service. Once our manufacturing or our production of goods and services adhere to those principles, we'll get greater demand on a global stage, and then we'll be able to produce more domestically. And when we produce more domestically, we will now have to employ more and more people into from the job market.
Okay, Dr. Kale, let's take a look at inflation, which I know that when you were at the Bureau of Statistics, we were always getting that data at least monthly. You improved the system, which is still on right now. But I want to take a look at the constitution of Nigeria's inflation basket, especially the CPI household consumption, which I know that the methodology is supposed to be reviewed. And the one that we're using now is 2009. So with that methodology for household consumption, how true and how realistic is the inflation picture that we're getting in Nigeria concerning CPI, that's Consumer Price Index, 21.91% is at February. In fact, someone sent me a message in February, no, in March, early March, when the February inflation came out. When I did say it here on the show that 21.9% is headline inflation for February, and the person sent me and said, no, inflation in Nigeria is more than 21.19%, is around 40 to 50%. I did not even respond because I didn't know what to respond. But that is actually what some Nigerians think. So how can you just suppose that with the methodology of 2009, which the MBS currently uses?
Well, I would first of all say that inflation of 40-50%. I would say that everybody has their own individual inflation rate. And that's because it depends on what I am buying. I have my own individual consumption basket. You have yours. And what I'm buying and what you are buying might not be the same thing. I might be buying things whose prices move a lot faster than yours. So I might, or vice versa. So in my own consumption basket, inflation might be less than 21% because of what I buy now. Let me give you an example. Assuming 80% of my expenditure is more on telecommunications. Telecommunications prices have not increased significantly. So my own inflation basket, inflation probably a lot less than 21% because I'm spending most of my money on telecommunication services. Now, if you are spending more of your money on food, your inflation might be much higher than 21%. But 21% is an aggregate. It's an average of the entire country, all 200 or so million Nigerians' consumption baskets, and it pulls an average. And when you have that situation, it means that inflation is higher than 21 and is lower than 21, but the average on the aggregate is 21%. A lot of people don't understand that when they think on inflation. But going to your question directly, yes, anytime your methodology is outdated, and the longer it stays outdated, the accuracy of that data becomes more and more less and less reliable. That is standard fact, and that's why it's always recommended internationally that you update your methodologies depending on which indicator every 2 years, every 3 years, every year,
Five
every five
years.
years. In particular, for the consumer price index, it's recommended to be updated every 5 years. So yes, since 2009 and we're in 2023, it is clearly baskets have changed. Telecommunication used to have a very small weight in the 2009 consumption basket. It was less than 1%. We all know that that's not the case today. If you look at the latest consumption expenditure report by NBS for 2019, which is the one that probably will be used when it is reversed, you will see that there's a huge change in terms of the weight, in terms of the breakdown between what how households spend. Think items like food outside, eating outside the house has jumped up significantly. I think that's even one of the largest shares of consumption. Items like transportation has gone up significantly, telecommunication has gone up significantly. So in certain areas, there's a clear distinction between the 2009 weight based on the 2009 consumption expenditure basket compared to the current 2019-2020 household consumption, which the new weights are going to be based on. Um, this is why there was a process, well, like I said, when I was there, that to rebase this. You remember the GDP rebasing. The
Yeah,
reason
I
why
was
we
coming
had
to
such a
that.
huge jump again was because we haven't done it for 30 years, and that's why it jumped up so significantly. So the longer it takes for you to review your methodology as it's expected, the more realistic the numbers are, and the longer you take, there can be significant jumps or changes to the eventual result. I expect that there will be some clear changes between the 2009 inflation and 2019 when the process is completed by the National Bureau of Statistics. And it might end up being higher or lower. It just depends. Like I mentioned, telecommunications has a much higher weight, but prices related to telecommunications doesn't go up as much. So it might even end up being less than 21. We don't know this. It's unlikely, but it's also possible. It depends on how the basket changes. The basket is still predominantly food, that has not changed, but within the non-food items, there are lots of significant changes. And even within the food items, the proportion of things like cereals, rice, and so on, as a share of food expenditure has changed. I think it's now dominating compared to 2009 when it was tubers. So again, it depends on what the change is and the level of price changes in those individual components in the food basket.
Mm. Okay. Doctor, I want us to argue this fact a bit, which you said earlier, that it depends on my inflation could be different from yours. But how do you juxtapose that to the household expenditure data from the NBS that says that Nigerians spend close to three-quarters of their income on food alone? So whatever inflation that you have, if whatever inflation you are suffering, we all have a commonality, which is about three-quarters of our income is being spent on food. So how do you argue that with what you told me earlier, with what you postulated earlier?
Nancy, again, that's an average.
Mm-hmm.
And you will notice that if you break it down to, if you look at the states, you'll find that some states like Lagos, they actually spend less on food, unlike other states, like particularly in the northern part of the country. Again, so it's the average. So depending on which state you go to, you find that some states like Lagos, it's almost a 50-50 split. And in some particular parts of Lagos, you find that they even spend more on non-food items than food items. But because you're looking at an average,
Mm-hmm.
uh, development theory will tell you that as people get richer, they tend to spend a smaller proportion of their
Oh,
income
food.
on food. So the richer parts of Nigeria are spending a lot less of their income on food. But because Nigeria has a larger poverty level, you will find that a larger proportion of the country is spending more on food, and that's why the overall average is, like you said, three-quarters. But that doesn't mean that every Nigerian across the country is spending 60% of their income on food. The richer the area, the less they're spending on food. But the richer areas are less than the poorer areas. And that's why you still have consumption expenditure dominated by food. And because food is not really it's not discretionary income. You have to buy food.
Food. Yeah.
So if you don't have enough money, you're going to buy food first because you have to survive, and then you buy other things afterwards. But once your food needs have been taken, then you can spend the rest of your income on all different kinds of non-food related luxuries.
Okay. Okay, you talked about GDP rebasing and you actually brought it out of my mouth because I was coming to that. With Nigeria's economy was rebased when you were the statistician general, I think in 2013, when the current DG of the WTO was the coordinator of the economy and the finance minister, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Then both of you did say that the GDP will be rebased, I think every 5 years. We've not had any GDP rebasing at that time. Now, 10 years. So what do you think? Do you have any ears to the ground as to what is happening?
Well, I don't have any ears to the ground relating to regarding what has happened since I left, but I know what we were doing before I did. And that's one of the things I mentioned in my exit speech that I regret not completing before I left, because it was one of the targets that I wanted to rebase one more time before I left, but I couldn't. And there was a reason why. To do a new GDP rebasing, you need to do a new census of industries and businesses. That was more or less completed just before I left. And then you need to do an agricultural census, which, from what I understand, the National Bureau of Statistics is currently working on. Those two have to be completed as a way to get a clearer sectoral breakdown and to capture new economic activities, gambling and things like that. Now, until you get a new frame for your economic activity for the latest year, you can't rebase. And to do that, you have to do the census of industries and businesses and the census of agriculture. Now, the census of business and industry was completed before I left, but agriculture had not started. And the reason is, again, funding. Those to conduct a census, whether it's a population census or an agriculture census, a business census, costs a lot of money. A business census entails you going to every establishment on every street in every local government across the 36 states of the federation and FCT. It's not something you do in a few weeks, and it's something that costs a lot of money. And agriculture is the same thing. You have to go to every farmland, every poultry, every fishery across the country and get a clear address. It's a census, so it costs lots of money. And the reason why we could not complete it is because there was a delay in getting the funding for the business census, and there was a delay in getting the funding um, for the agricultural census. There are three things. First of all, the consumption expenditure pattern that was completed. Then the business census has to be completed. Then the agricultural census has to be completed. All those three things are prerequisites for you
Okay.
to rebase your economy. And so I think that the NBS is currently doing the agricultural census. I understand, and I believe that once that is done, the conditions to complete this, to complete the next rebasing be completed.
Okay, doctor, just we have about 2 minutes or 3 minutes to go. I can't leave you without asking you what you think about the fuel subsidy removal, because I see that that is taking a front line page in most dailies now, and people, even labor, is discussing it. What do you think should be the cost benefit analysis? A lot of people are saying let's remove it so that the economy will be better. Some other people are saying no, don't remove it, that it will push inflation, Nigerians will suffer more. What do you think about that? Now, let me put a caveat. Do you think that the fuel subsidy regime has been adequately investigated, is adequately transparent? Because when it comes to even the consumption of fuel in Nigeria, we really do not know how much or how many liters we consume. I remember from the Desiani days, it was about 30 million liters, 33 million. It grew to about 50, 60, now about 63 or so. We do not know how many liters we do consume, though NNPC has come out to say, I think about 60 or so. There was a time that customs uh, uh, denied that. There was a time that customs did say, no, that is not true. What do you think also about the transparent management system of the process, before we begin to talk about whether we are doing fuel subsidy in a very good manner or it should be removed?
Well, Nancy, I think you answered your own question. When you have question marks, we do not know this, we are not sure how many, that already suggests the definition of transparency is openness. And if you have question marks of any kind around that something, then clearly it's not transparent. I think that's straightforward. I think those doubts already exist. And at my time at the NBS, what we use is number of trucks, number of trucks and the amount of liters of fuel they are taking around the country. That is not the best way to determine consumption of PMS, because if you check the breakdown, you see that most of the trucks and most of the supply is usually to border towns, which suggests that maybe a lot of this fuel is even finding its way to neighboring countries, and that those consumption of Nigerians cannot be equated to number of trucks carrying X number of liters across the country. Um, I think I don't think it's once there's a transparency issue and you are not able to even decode what Nigerians need, and it's costing you a huge amount of money, such that it is bigger than your combined budget for health, education, infrastructure. I don't think the question should even be, is it even being done transparently or not? At this point, I think we have gotten to a stage where even if it was being done transparently, even if the total amount of money that have been spent, increasing amount of money that have been spent on subsidy is correct, it has got to a point where the countries can simply not pay for it. And it's not, I don't think it's we should be having this qualitative conversation. Oh, it's going to do
Okay.
this. Oh, the benefits are this. I think it should be quantitative. Let's look at all the benefits, quantitative and qualitative, and all the costs, and then we decide. And when you've done that, this is the number of people that are going to suffer from taking it off. This is the level of poverty that's going to be increased, for example. This is the level of inflation. Then you look at whether the benefits are going to outweigh the cost, and
Okay.
how you can use those benefits to minimize the impact of the cost. I think
Okay.
that's what we should be having a conversation on.
Well, okay, doctor, I think we'll continue this conversation on another day. Thank you very much for joining me today. I'll talk to you soon. Have a good
Thank you,
week.
Nancy. And you too.
All right, I've been speaking with Dr. Yemi Kale, who is a partner and the chief economist at KPMG Nigeria. He was the Statistician General of the Federation, as well as the chief executive officer of the MBS. That's the much we can take on today's edition of the program. Thank you all for joining us. I am Nancy Naji. Be the best you can be, but the change that you want to see. Bye now.